Hello and welcome to this session on the papal encyclical Fratelli Tutti, what catechists, catechetical leaders, and other ministry leaders should know. First, I just want to say a few words about what an encyclical is. An encyclical is one of the highest forms of communication by the Pope. It's more formal than, say, an apostolic exhortation or an apostolic letter. It's ranked second in importance, only behind an apostolic constitution. And this is only the third encyclical letter from Pope Francis. The other two were Lumen Fidei in 2013 and Laudato Si in 2015. Here are the purpose and the stated goals of Fratelli Tutti. In paragraph 8 of the introduction, Pope Francis says, "It is my desire that in this our time, by acknowledging the dignity of each human person, we can contribute to the rebirth of a universal aspiration to fraternity." The title for this document is inspired by a quote from Francis of Assisi. Of course, Francis of Assisi is the saint from which Pope Francis took his papal name. And the content flows from one of St. Francis's councils, in which he calls, and I'm quoting here from the document, in which he calls for a love that transcends the barriers of geography and distance and declares blessed all those who love their brother, as much when he is far away from him as when he is with him. Um, Pope Francis says, "Issues of human fraternity and social friendship have always been a concern of mine. In this encyclical, I've sought to bring together many of those statements and situate them in a broader context of reflection." Now, this encyclical takes up and develops themes from the document on human fraternity for world peace and living together, which was a joint statement made by Pope Francis and Grand Imam Ahmed Al-Tayeb following their meeting in Abu Dhabi. The purpose, Pope Francis says, is not to offer a complete teaching on fraternal love, but rather to consider its universal scope, its openness to every man and woman. And he also intends this encyclical to be an invitation to dialogue among all people of goodwill. So this isn't just directed toward Catholics and the Catholic Church, but Pope Francis says to all people of goodwill. Here's how the document is organized. There's an introduction and 8 chapters, and the chapters cover the following topics. Topics like contemporary challenges and obstacles to fraternity and social friendship. So what gets in the way of the world community coming together in love for one another? Biblical foundations of fraternal love, a vision for a more open world that promotes the common good. Interestingly here, and you'll see this phrase, the common good, throughout the document, the common good means the good of everyone, with particular attention to the good of the least of those among us, because we haven't really considered the common good unless we first considered those who are the most vulnerable among us. And so you'll see this theme come up again and again throughout the document. I think it's helpful here also to differentiate this term, the common good, from another term that we hear often in public discourse, which is the greater good. Now, the greater good can turn into a utilitarian concept, because sometimes you hear discussions of doing things that are not ethical on their face or are immoral as an act, but because we did them in the service of the greater good, somehow, sometimes people will try to justify them. So the idea of the common good is a different concept than society's conversation about the greater good. The common good means the good of everyone, and with particular attention and protection for those who are most vulnerable. Here also in the document, we see reflections on migration and international relations. We see some words about the failure of current political systems to promote the common good, and then some solutions that Pope Francis proposes to those failures. A reflection on forgiveness and reconciliation. And then finally, the discussion of the role of religion in promoting fraternity and in promoting brotherly and sisterly love and community for one another. Chapter 1 is titled Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. And in this chapter, Pope Francis discusses, and I quote, trends in our world that hinder the development of universal fraternity. Some of these trends are a resurgence of conflicts after what has been a period of relative peace and progress. So, we had some of the worst conflicts that the world community has ever known in the first half of the 20th century, followed by some more localized conflicts, but a period of relative peace, some of which had to do with the cooperation between nations and the ways that nations collaborated on enforcing that peace and exerting pressure on aggressors in the world community. However, Pope Francis points out there has been an increase in nationalism and in other types of attitudes that hinder that international collaboration. And so he sees certainly the conditions emerging for real large-scale war and conflict again. He's very concerned about this. Also, in general, the failure to build societies that value each person's dignity. Um, so in many societies, in all societies really around the world, we have systems that benefit some people, but not all people, and particularly those who are the weakest and most vulnerable, who are less likely to have a voice in society. Pope Francis talks about increased globalization without a shared roadmap. What does he mean by that? He means that as globalization continues, and particularly economic connection around the world, that some people get left behind. Sometimes entire countries get left behind, and even within countries, certain people get left behind in that so-called progress. And then also the loss of the authentic encounter. What does he mean by that? He talks a lot about how a lot of the discourse today, and particularly what we see on social media, ends up being not a dialogue, but what he calls parallel monologues, in which people are talking at each other, are more concerned about getting their point across than they are about really listening and understanding others. Here are some notable quotes from that first chapter. Pope Francis says, "Goodness, together with love, justice, and solidarity, are not achieved once and for all. They have to be realized each day." Another quote, "To care for the world in which we live means to care for ourselves. Yet we need to think of ourselves more and more as a single family dwelling in a common home." We'll see this theme throughout this encyclical, this understanding of the reality that God has created us as one human family and that we have to work together. He also says an individual and a people are only fruitful and productive if they are able to develop a creative openness to others. We're also going to see that theme running throughout the document as well. And then finally, true wisdom demands an encounter with reality. We have to be honest about the situation. We have to do a good analysis of the situation, and we have to encounter one another in the real world and face the challenges that we face, the obstacles that we face to peace and to fraternity around the world. In chapter 2, Pope Francis takes up the parable of the Good Samaritan, which he's using as a foundation, as a jumping off point for talking about the kind of love for one another that we are called to as a human family. He also cites in this chapter the stories of Job, Cain and Abel, and other scripture passages that are related to fraternal love. So for example, in the account of Cain and Abel, he zooms in on that quote where God asks Cain, where's your brother? And he says, oh, I don't know, am I my brother's keeper? And this understanding that in a very real way, we are called to be the keeper of our sisters and brothers. We're called to care for one another. As he comes back to that parable of the Good Samaritan, Pope Francis draws a connection between those who pass by the Good Samaritan and our modern society's tendency to look away from or to pass by those who are suffering. Here are some notable quotes from chapter 2. He says, "Love does not care. if a brother or sister in need comes from one place or another. He's concerned about how much value we assign to or devalue that we assign to a particular place, and particularly with regard to migration. Um, so he's saying, what we learn from the parable of the Good Samaritan is that love doesn't care if a brother or sister in need comes from one place or another. Love cares for the person in need. He also says we're called to direct society to the pursuit of the common good, and with this purpose in mind, to to persevere in consolidating its political and social order, its fabric of relations, its human goals. Pope Francis says we were created for a fulfillment that can only be found in love. We see this theme a couple of times in the document, that we are made for love, that we are made for communion with one another. And to be truly human means to give of ourselves to one another. Pope Francis says, let us seek out others and embrace the world as it is, without fear of pain or a sense of inadequacy, because there we will discover all the goodness that God has planted in human hearts. He also says all of us have a responsibility for the wounded, those of our own people and all the peoples of the earth. Here are some catechetical notes in chapter 2, some things that I think would be of particular interest to those who hand on the faith to others. Pope Francis says, faith has untold power to inspire and sustain our respect for others. For believers come to know that God loves every man and woman with infinite love, and thereby confers infinite dignity upon all humanity. He also says it's important that catechesis and preaching speak more directly and clearly about the social meaning of existence, the fraternal dimension of spirituality, our conviction of the inalienable dignity of each person, and our reasons for loving and accepting all our brothers and sisters. One of the things that Pope Francis is very concerned about, and I think this is a very real need and challenge in our own culture in the United States, is the fact that people tend to view faith through their predetermined political lens. And so people tend to be, for example, Democrat or Republican first before they are Catholic. Pope Francis would like to turn that on its head and say our identity as children of God, as disciples of Christ, as members of the Catholic Church, should shape how we view political issues, not the other way around. And it's important that we present a very clear picture of what God calls us to when it comes to the spirituality of communion, when it comes to the inherent dignity of the human person, the sacredness of life, and that everything then that we do and say in the political arena can be shaped by that informed conscience. And so as Catholics, our responsibility is not, as catechists, is not, our responsibility is not to tell people how to vote or to tell people what party to belong to, but rather to form their conscience based on these principles that are fundamental to our faith and really fundamental to human existence, as Pope Francis will present here throughout the document. And then with that formed conscience, with that informed conscience, people then make decisions about how they speak out and how they act and how they vote in the political arena. Chapter 3 is titled Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. Here are some of the points that are made by Pope Francis in chapter 3. We must give of ourselves in order to be fully human. Again, taking up that point that we are made for communion with one another. We are made for self-gift. Pope Francis also says these gifts of self should extend not just to those in our immediate family or group, although that should be the first place that we give of ourselves. We also are called to not be insular, but to give to the larger world. Pope Francis says moral virtues are only rightly directed to the extent that they foster openness towards and union with others. We can't claim to be moral and then be closed off to others. He says true charity means seeking the good of the other. This is true not only for individuals, but for societies, which should include and integrate everyone, particularly people at the peripheries. Now, if you've heard me speak before on Pope Francis's writing, You might have heard me say that when Pope Francis uses this word peripheries, he's thinking of a particular place. As Archbishop, as Cardinal Archbishop of Buenos Aires in Argentina, in Buenos Aires, there is an area of town called the periferias, the peripheries. The periferias are those areas on the outskirts of town where the poorest of the poor, the most marginalized in society, live in their makeshift shanty housing and what we might consider slum communities. These are where the poorest of the poor are dwelling. And he is envisioning a church, when he talks about this, that goes out and meets people at the peripheries. It doesn't say, hey, you at the peripheries, you need to come to us. No, that we actually go out and make it a priority to minister to people who live in the periferias. So this is the image that he's conjuring up as he's writing about the peripheries. Pope Francis says all persons have equal dignity and are entitled to certain basic rights and freedoms, regardless of where they were born. And safeguarding that dignity is going to require a new network of international relations in which nations work together to meet the basic needs of all persons. It doesn't work if we're all just doing this unilaterally. It works if we're working together on this, Pope Francis would say. Here are some notable quotes from chapter 3. He says, a love capable of transcending borders is the basis of what in every city and country can be called social friendship. Pope Francis says, what we need, in fact, are states and civil institutions that are present and active, that look beyond the free and efficient working of certain economic, political, or ideological systems, and are primarily concerned with individuals and the common good. There's that phrase once more, the common good. A truly human and fraternal society, Pope Francis says, will be capable of ensuring in an efficient and stable way that each of its members is accompanied at every stage of life. And he also says, let us return to promoting the good for ourselves and for the whole human family, and thus advance together towards an authentic and integral growth. Here's a notable paragraph that I think applies particularly to those of us who are in catechesis and faith formation. And I hope you'll indulge me here as I quote a whole paragraph. I'm usually not quoting passages quite this lengthy, but I think this one is interesting. I would like especially to mention solidarity, which as a moral virtue and social attitude born of personal conversion, calls for commitment on the part of those responsible for education and formation. I think first of families called to a primary and vital mission of education. Families are the place where the values of love and fraternity, togetherness and sharing, concern and care for others are lived out and handed on. They're also the privileged milieu for transmitting the faith, beginning with those first simple gestures of devotion which mothers teach their children. Teachers who have the challenging task of training children and youth in schools or other settings should be conscious that their responsibility extends also to the moral, spiritual, and social aspects of life. The values of freedom, mutual respect, and solidarity can be handed on from a tender age. Communicators also have a responsibility for education and formation, especially nowadays when the means of information and communication are so widespread. Chapter 4 is titled, A Heart Open to the Whole World. In this chapter, Pope Francis begins to talk about some concrete steps that he feels are required for realizing a fraternity that includes everyone. He talks specifically about migration. He says the first priority is reducing the necessity of migration by working together to ensure that all people have the conditions necessary for dignity and human development. So, before nations can really put firm limits or close their borders to migrants coming from other places, they need to be asking themselves, have we done everything that we can do to work together with poor nations, with nations that are less developed, to ensure the dignity, the conditions necessary for dignity and human development in those nations? What are we doing for people in those countries that migrants are coming from, that they're feeling the need to leave because it's dangerous or because they don't have what they need to live in those countries? He also says, on the other side of that, that for people who do migrate, we need to have some clear and practical steps to welcome those refugees and migrants and integrate them into society. He talks about the history from Scripture um, of God's admonitions toward His people to be welcoming of the refugee, of the stranger, to help provide for their needs. Here, Pope Francis talks about the need for global collaboration. Again, it's not going to work if this is a unilateral effort. We need to work together to address the causes of migration and also to make sure that we're caring for migrants. He talks about the gifts that are brought by different perspectives and cultures. We certainly see that in the United States, which has been historically a nation of immigrants. So many immigrants who have come together from different places and different cultures and made this country the great nation that it is. Pope Francis calls us to continue to appreciate those gifts, both here in the United States and around the world, that countries that are accepting migrants need to welcome them and also look for the gifts that they bring, those unique gifts and talents that can be brought by cultural diversity. And he also talks about not only do we need to look for those gifts, but we need to have an attitude of fraternal gratuitousness, that we accept people, we welcome migrants not just for the gifts that they bring, the way they can benefit us, which would be a utilitarian kind of perspective. But sometimes we do this simply because God calls us to do it, even when it doesn't seem to benefit us. And Pope Francis makes that point as well, that we need to be looking to welcome it, and not just the stranger who might be able to offer us something, but the stranger who has nothing to offer, who we might be able to shelter and offer some opportunity for growth and development. Some notable quotes from chapter 4. Pope Francis says, our response to the arrival of migrating persons can be summarized by 4 words: welcome, protect, promote, and integrate. He also says the arrival of those who are different, coming from other ways of life and cultures, can be a gift, for the stories of migrants are always stories of an encounter between individuals and between cultures. He says when we open our hearts to those who are different, this enables them, while continuing to be themselves, to develop in new ways. He says we need to develop the awareness that nowadays we are either all saved together or no one is saved. He also talks about this, incidentally, with respect to the issues that we encountered when the pandemic started and the lockdowns around the country, and the feelings of vulnerability that we had, and the solidarity that we experienced as one human family that was dealing with this around the world. That we were coming to the realization that we are either all saved together or no one is saved. And he says this is a general theme, not just the pandemic, that this is true about many challenges and issues that we face as a world community. Pope Francis says the true worth of different countries of our world is measured by their ability to think not simply as a country, but also as part of the larger human family. And finally, he says, for a healthy relationship between love of one's native land and a sound sense of belonging to our larger human family, it's helpful to keep in mind that global society is not the sum total of different countries, but rather the communion that exists among them. Chapter 5 is titled A Better Kind of Politics. This chapter discusses the limitations of both populism and liberalism when they fail to protect the dignity of the most vulnerable. Now, I should probably add here that when Pope Francis speaks of liberalism and populism, these are not categories that can neatly be correlated with, for example, Democrats and Republicans in the United States. The liberalism he's talking about here is economic liberalism, free market economy. The populism he's talking about are, popular movements when populist leaders particularly kind of appeal to groups that might feel like they have in the past been overlooked or marginalized, and then you have a movement emerging in a country, sometimes even leads to revolution, these populist movements. And so he's not specifically talking about conservative or liberal as we might understand it in the United States, but there are points made here that I think are very applicable to situations politically that we're facing in the US as well. So we'll talk about that as we go. He also says that multilateral rather than bilateral agreements between states are recommended in order to better promote the common good and protect weaker states. So we shouldn't just have these bilateral agreements between the US and one other country, for example, to use an illustration here in the United States, but rather as much as possible to work together as a world community. Subsidiarity, which is the principle of solving problems and challenges at the most local level possible, is also emphasized here as a way to guard against the shortcomings of the state and avoid the negative effects of globalization. So this principle of subsidiarity follows the logic that often problems are best solved at the most local level possible, because that's where we can be most aware of everybody, including the most vulnerable among us. And so I say that to say Pope Francis here is not necessarily advocating that everything be solved at this global level, but rather that global problems, global challenges be worked on at a global level, and local challenges be addressed at a more local level. Here are some notable quotes from chapter 5. Pope Francis says, the development of a global community of fraternity based on the practice of social friendship on the part of peoples and nations calls for a better kind of politics, one truly at the service of the common good. He says, lack of concern for the vulnerable can hide behind a populism that exploits them demagogically for its own purposes, or a liberalism that serves the economic interests of the powerful. And he says, everything then depends on our ability to see the need for a change of heart, attitudes, and lifestyles. Otherwise, political propaganda, the media, and the shapers of public opinion will continue to promote an individualistic and uncritical culture subservient to unregulated economic interests and societal institutions at the service of those who already enjoy too much power. Some more quotes from chapter 5. Education and upbringing, concern for others, a well-integrated view of life and spiritual growth. All these are essential for quality human relationships and for enabling society itself to react against injustices, aberrations, and abuses of economic, technological, political, and media power. Pope Francis says, charity finds expression not only in close and intimate relationships, but also in macro relationships, social, economic, and political. He says, each of us is fully a person when we are part of a people. At the same time, there are no peoples without respect for the individuality of each person. Charity, he says, with its impulse to universality, is capable of building a new world, no mere sentiment. It is the best means of discovering effective paths of development for everyone. Chapter 6 is called Dialogue and Friendship in Society. In this chapter, Pope Francis distinguishes contemporary frenetic exchanges on social media, which he calls parallel monologues, I mentioned that earlier, from authentic dialogue, which involves the ability to respect the other's point of view and to admit that it may include legitimate convictions and concerns. So being able to actually listen and understand somebody else's perspective, even if we don't agree with it, is so essential in dialogue. And Pope Francis says only through respectful, rational dialogue that includes multiple perspectives can society arrive at a consensus around the truths necessary for its continued existence. Now, Pope Francis in this chapter, he also cautions against a subjective point of view that would lead to relativism, So, he's not talking about relativism. He's not talking about being relativistic as we consider multiple points of view. He really believes that if we have a rational dialogue based on truth, that we can arrive as a human family to certain kinds of conclusions. That if we really listen to one another, one of the things that is absolutely essential and necessary to our existence as a human race is this idea that the human person has dignity and that all life has dignity. So Pope Francis expresses a lot of confidence that this particular principle and other principles that are foundational are wired within the human heart, that this is just part of natural law. But he feels like we have to be engaging in that respectful and rational dialogue in order to arrive there. Um, and he says at the heart of these truths is the inherent dignity of the human person. Here are some notable quotes from chapter 6. Um, if we want to if we want to encounter and help one another, we have to dialogue. Another quote I really like: the heroes of the future will be those who can break with this unhealthy mindset and determine respectfully to promote truthfulness aside from personal interest. So not just putting the spin we need to get our point across and make us sound right, but rather to really seek the truth together. Public discussion, he says, if it truly makes room for everyone and does not manipulate or conceal information, is a constant stimulus to a better grasp of the truth, or at least its more effective expression. Pope Francis says in a pluralistic society, in a society where we have multiple viewpoints, multiple faith perspectives, and also no faith perspective, dialogue is the best way to realize what ought always to be affirmed and respected, apart from any ephemeral consensus. Such dialogue needs to be enriched and illumined by clear thinking, rational arguments, a variety of perspectives, and the contribution of different fields of knowledge and points of view. If you've read Pope Francis, that he also is very much an advocate for a dialogue between faith and the sciences, for example, because we can be, as people of faith, informed by science, and also our faith helps to inform science. We can have good conversations about making sure that science really works in the public interest and protects the common good, the good of everyone. Okay, a metaphor that we find in this chapter that Pope Francis has used elsewhere as well is this metaphor of a polyhedron. And so I want to talk about that for just a moment. What he says here, I have frequently called for the growth of a culture of encounter capable of transcending our differences and divisions. This means working to create a many-faceted polyhedron whose different sides form a variegated unity in which the whole is greater than the part. The image of a polyhedron can represent a society where differences coexist, complementing, enriching, and reciprocally illuminating one another, even amid disagreements and reservations. Each of us can learn something from the others. No one is useless and no one is expendable. This also means finding ways to include those on the peripheries of life, for they have another way of looking at things. They see aspects of reality that are invisible to the centers of power where weighty decisions are made. So this image here, this three-dimensional polyhedron, you can see there are different surfaces that are different colors, kind of representing the different perspectives, the different groups, the different interests, and yet they form one whole. And by understanding the different surfaces, the different perspectives, and how they contribute to the whole, we get the full picture. And this is Pope Francis's metaphor of the polyhedron. He sees the world community being like this. He sees communion with one another being like this, that we all kind of come at this from our different perspectives, but we all also form one whole. So we need to learn about one another. We need to dialogue with one another. Chapter 7 is titled Paths of Renewed Encounter. One of the things that Pope Francis says in this chapter is that the wounds that are inflicted by prior conflicts remain as barriers to meaningful encounter and dialogue in many places. We have to get to the truth there. We have to we have to look at those wounds. We have to acknowledge them. We can't just pretend like they don't exist. We need to speak truth in order to really get to reconciliation. Pope Francis says facing the past and seeking truth and justice are prerequisites to reconciliation and forgiveness. He says negotiation is better than violent demonstrations and finding solutions and building lasting peace. Um, he also says the best place to begin a process of building social friendships in a particular society is with those who are most vulnerable and most impoverished, because if we haven't cared for them, then we haven't really looked out for the common good. But if we have cared for them, then we've made leaps and bounds toward looking out for the common good. Here are some notable quotes from chapter 7. Pope Francis says, in many parts of the world, there's a need for paths of peace to heal open wounds. There's also a need for peacemakers, men and women prepared to work boldly and creatively to initiate processes of healing and renewed encounter. Pope Francis says, those who work for tranquil social coexistence should never forget that inequality and lack of integral human development make peace impossible. Those who truly forgive do not forget, Pope Francis says. Instead, they choose not to yield to the same destructive force that caused them so much suffering. What he's saying here is that choosing to forgive doesn't mean that we're overlooking what's happened in the past. It means that we're not going to continue carrying that anger. We're not going to continue to repeat that cycle or allow that anger to be destructive towards us. We're going to let go of it in the name of moving forward. Pope Francis says there are two extreme situations that may come to be seen as solutions in especially dramatic circumstances, without realizing that they are false answers that do not resolve problems they are meant to solve, and ultimately do no more than introduce new elements of destruction in the fabric of national and global society. These are war and the death penalty. Pope Francis in this encyclical, and particularly in this chapter, really challenges even our just war theories and understandings. He's really pushing back on that and saying, this can no longer be seen as a solution. He also invokes the arguments of Saint Pope John Paul II with regard to the death penalty, and saying very similar things, that this is not a necessary or productive solution, and can't be viewed anymore as a viable alternative. And in fact, Pope Francis already has spoken very definitively in the revisions to the Catechism on the death penalty, and now also enshrines this in an encyclical letter, this position that Catholics simply can't support the death penalty as a solution. Chapter 8 is titled Religions at the Service of Fraternity in Our World. This chapter begins by stressing the impossibility of real fraternity without an openness to the Father of all. We're sisters and brothers to one another because we share a common Father. Pope Francis says, without a belief in transcendent truth, we lack a foundation for universal principles governing the relationships between human beings, leaving us vulnerable to the forces of power. So I want to pick this apart a little bit, because what he's saying here is that if there is such a thing as objective truth, if there is a higher principle governing human behavior, for example, the dignity of life, the fact that we can't just simply take lives, we can't kill one another, where does that principle come from? Why is that a truth? It's an objective truth, so it must come from an objective source. And so Pope Francis is saying this transcendent truth, this universal principle, has to come from God. It has to come from faith. Otherwise, we are reduced to listening to whoever is the loudest and most powerful voice as we seek truth. Pope Francis says religions have an important role to play when they seek God with sincerity. Some notable quotes from chapter 8. He says it's wrong when the only voices to be heard in public debate are those of the powerful and experts. Room needs to be made for reflections born of religious traditions that are the repository of centuries of experience and wisdom. He says, for these reasons, the church, while respecting the autonomy of political life, does not restrict her mission to the private sphere. On the contrary, she cannot and must not remain on the sidelines in the building of a better world, or fail to reawaken the spiritual energy that can contribute to the betterment of society. Here, Pope Francis is saying religion and faith have a role here in this dialogue. We have wisdom to share. We have this understanding of a transcendent truth, of a universal principle that has to be brought into this conversation. Pope Francis says a journey of peace is possible between religions. Its point of departure must be God's way of seeing things. We have to strive to get to the truth. We have to seek God with sincerity of heart. Pope Francis says violence has no basis in our fundamental religious convictions, but only in their distortion. So he's saying if we're honestly seeking God, that's not going to lead us to violence. So he's eschewing any kind of fundamentalism that leads to terrorism or violence on the part of religious groups. That summarizes the document, and I also want to mention some additional resources here that I hope you'll find valuable. I strongly encourage you to actually read the document for yourself. And OSV's version of this, Fratelli Tutti, has also some great discussion questions that are going to be useful for individual reflection or group study. We also have a forthcoming pamphlet on Fratelli Tutti that will be available in multi-packs, as all of our pamphlets are. And that should be available soon from OSV as well. That'll offer you a brief summary of the document that you can share with others. Thank you.